Hello and welcome to the future of biotech, and thank you for joining us. In this episode, our first episode, we're exploring sustainable aviation fuels. Air travel is a hallmark of our modern world, and yet it contributes disproportionately to greenhouse gas emissions while relying on globalized supply chains with little resilience to geopolitical shocks, as we're currently learning. Sustainable aviation fuel technology is poised to tackle those intersecting challenges, promising lower emissions and sovereign supply in a tumultuous world. If you haven't watched our SAF Explainer episode, go back and watch that first to get up to speed, because today we have the distinct pleasure of introducing to you two distinguished experts in the policy, production, and potential of sustainable aviation fuel. Shahana Mckenzie is the Chief Executive Officer of Bioenergy Australia. Bioenergy Australia is the national industry association committed to accelerating Australia's bioeconomy. Their work seeks to empower and connect Australian bioenergy producers, investors, and researchers to create a world-class bioeconomy ecosystem. And we're also very grateful to be joined by Mr. Deepak Ballani, the Director General of the Indian Sugar and Bioenergy Manufacturers Association, ISMA. ISMA is the apex association of private Indian sugar mills and is the largest consortium of sugar and bioenergy manufacturers in India, serving as the voice of the Indian sugarcane industry and the 55 million farmers associated with it for the last 93 years. Thank you both for joining us and for being so generous with your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, just to begin very briefly, I wonder if you could outline for our listeners the state of SAF in Australia and in India. We introduced in our previous SAF Explainer video that globally SAF still comprises less than 1% of total global jet fuel use. So, what does the situation look like on the ground today? What infrastructure is live? What's in the pipeline? And what does the next year or couple of years hold for Australian and Indian SAF effort? And so I might start with you, Shahana, if you could give an overview of the Australian landscape for SAF.
Sure. And thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. Where we currently sit in Australia in relation to sustainable aviation fuel is part of, I suppose, a bigger journey around where we sit with low carbon liquid fuels. Australia sits around 10 to 15 years behind. So whether it's first generation or second generation fuels, to be frank. However, what we have seen over the last term of this government have been some significant commitments to policy, which has really accelerated the level of engagement of global investors, project developers, traditional fuel refiners and the like. So whilst we don't have any SAF currently being produced in Australia, we do have it being imported into country. So it is being used in country. So we're starting to kind of have it as part of the system. And we have had a number of projects that have been announced. So it is anticipated, based on the policy announcements that we've received, that we will be producing in excess of 2 billion litres of low carbon liquid fuels by 2030. And a decent proportion of that is going to be sustainable aviation fuel. So we're on the right path, but we're not yet making any.
And Deepak, what are things looking like for SAF in India in the current?
Yeah. Basically, especially the recent geopolitical stability in West Asia has basically strengthened the very strategic case of SAF in India. Suddenly, it has become a matter of discussions within the entire stakeholder, and specifically with respect to the issues which we are facing because of the fluctuations in the crude market. And that has really enforced the importance of the domestic renewable aviation fuel for energy security. And recently, in April 26, Government of India formally brought SAF blended aviation turbine fuel under the control order, which is called an ATF control order, which normally creates a regulatory framework to operationalize SAF blending in aviation. So that basically reaffirms the blending targets of 1% by 2027, followed by 28, 2%, and in 2030 around 5%. So that's a very big policy shift which we have seen. And India, we are very uniquely positioned because we have surplus alcohol, and alcohol to jet is perhaps the most viable feedstock which we have, the pathway which we have. And we are hoping that all the potential, the technology being there, we will be able to produce almost, for example, 1.1 billion liters of SAF by 2027, around 4 billion liters by 2040, because in terms of our alcohol, we have today a capacity of 20 billion, while we are only using around 11 billion liters for the ethanol. So it's a huge strategy. But having said that, we still don't have a proper alcohol to jet facility. There are a few companies who are in the pipeline of setting up the manufacturing facility. We are only hoping that government will roll out a proper roadmap, a policy roadmap, very similar to what ethanol blending also they had. So if the policy is there, which I hope that will be soon, I believe the investment will start flowing and we'll see the capacity very soon. Yeah.
And so under those particular sort of that 1% blending by 2027, is that something that India is going to be able to reach with its own domestic capacity by then, or will it find itself in a similar situation to Australia, needing to import that SAF from external countries to begin with, at least?
So to begin with, we at 1%, the requirement is not going to be very heavy. Having said that, alcohol to jet, I believe the first plant will only come by 2029. But until 2%, we already have the HEFA feedstock which could produce SAF. And we already have some oil marketing companies who have started investing into producing SAF from HEFA. So I believe until 1 to 2%, we should be able to manage with our own feedstock. And then perhaps we will have a follow-up by an alcohol to jet facility by 2020.
Okay. Shahana, I wanted to follow up on, you mentioned the potential for Australia to reach 2 billion low carbon liquid fuels. What is the sort of policy, the domestic policy environment that's shaping that particular goal, or should I say, how is that domestic policy driving us in that direction?
Yeah, so since we had the change of government at the federal level, we've had a pretty strong ambition from the government to support the development of this industry. And that's pretty much from the starting, like zero. There was no policy frameworks really. So initially, we had the commitment by Minister Catherine King, the Minister for Infrastructure, to the commitment of and transport of the establishment of the Australian Jet Zero Council, which effectively was a council that was co-chaired or engaged across industry, government, to really work on how do we support decarbonisation of aviation. Out of that process, and with advocacy bodies such as ours, we have advocated really heavily for a raft of different things. And so what that has resulted in has been $250 million that has been allocated to the Australian Renewable Energy Agency. So that's for like co-investment, so a grant program effectively. So it's not a loan, it is there, and you have to co-invest. So you have to match the amount of money. But that could be feasibility studies, that could be actual capital. There's a range of different options. So that program is open right now. So projects are applying into that program. We then had in October of last year an announcement from the government to the commitment of $1.1 billion in production incentives to start in 2028. So projects will be able to start applying to be a part of that. But because we're expecting the first fuel to be flowing, as in renewable diesel and SAF, in 2028, effectively they're thinking that that's when the money will start going into the system. We have then had the commitment from the federal government to the development of a national bioenergy feedstock strategy. So that's something that we've been advocating for a range of reasons. One of the primary reasons is around social license and really having a very strong sustainability lens and focus in how we develop this industry in Australia. and how there is this strong relationship and input from Australia's ag sector into us moving to a place where instead of Australia's ag sector being food and fibre, it's food, fibre and fuel. And that we're actually, looking at the 3Fs in terms of how we move forward. We then, in the last week, which is pretty exciting for us, at the announcement of the federal budget last week, the government committed to delivering on a demand side measure. So that demand side measure is effectively a mandate or something similar, a low carbon fuel standard like California. So they committed to delivering that they are actually going to deliver that last week at the budget, and they will be coming out for consultation on the kind of finer design points of what that would look like, when it would start, what percentages, and the like. So that's kind of where we sit right now in terms of the progress around sustainable aviation fuels. And I think, for us, one of the things that has, I think, one of the main reasons that the government made the announcement last week at budget was because of the fuel security crisis and this very strong acknowledgement in Australia that we are heavily reliant on imported fuels and really exposed when there are global shocks. And so the government is really, kind of taking a very different approach and look to how we develop that resilience domestically.
I mean, that's fantastic news to hear that they have committed to that mandate. I mean, I've heard you speak before about just how important a mandate is to really drive the development of these technologies. It's really maybe the only way to reliably get an ecosystem off the ground. I actually wanted to pivot now. You've both mentioned sort of the elephant in the room being the ongoing fuel crisis. Obviously, there's a lot of interest in the fuel situation, the fuel security. Do you get the impression that these conversations have the staying power yet? Are they really? Are you seeing real shift in interest towards SAF, or are you worried that this interest might start to dry up if things begin to stabilize in the near term? Deepak, I wonder if we could start with you for that question.
Sure. See, basically, the West Asia crisis only brought the urgency to the discussions with the government and the policy makers and the stakeholders were doing. But I believe the government here in India was already working on some of these pathways, some of these policies for quite a long time. And I remember last year, ISMA, and we also undertook a proper project with Deloitte and came up with a complete roadmap on rollout of SAF in India. We also undertook a LCA with a very renowned institution specifically to find out the CI index and how perhaps that could bring some kind of an advantage in cost in terms of carbon offsetting for the sugarcane, ethanol and alcohol to that pathway. And based on various stakeholder discussions last year, only after the West Asia crisis, I said, it has only brought urgency. The government has come out with a draft of a policy and which clearly lays out the roadmap for the SAF in India, which estimates approximately 750 million tons of biomass availability in India and how much we can perhaps produce by 2030. So with the roadmap is projecting around 8 to 10 million tons of SAF to be annually produced by 2030. And the roadmap by the government, and that is where we believe the entire approach, the seriousness and the approach brings, is that it has also included the entire SAF ecosystem and the entire value chain in terms of feedstock aggregation, in terms of certification, blending, distribution and monitoring. And it basically prioritizes a globally accepted pathway specifically depending on the feedstock availability. A very strong regulatory mechanism is also being put up by the government under the leadership of Ministry of Civil Aviation, which will perhaps coordinate with the Petroleum Ministry here the Environment Ministry, the Director General of Civil Aviation, the oil marketing companies. Having said that, I believe uh, there are still a lot of challenges, I think, are there, specifically with regard to the financial and how the market-based supporting mechanisms will evolve, because the investment in this is very high, and the companies have to see, the investors have to see a proper ROI. So I believe the government is also working very seriously on how to integrate the carbon markets, maybe the viability gap funding, or basically a carbon finance mechanism. We have a CCTS, and specifically under CORSI and Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. I believe, I think the crisis has only brought the urgency, and I think it's just a matter of time when things will actually taking shape in the country, specifically in India, on the SAF ecosystem.
Shahana, do you have a perspective on this?
Yeah, so I think it's difficult to, I think, speak about this just in relation to sustainable aviation fuel because, what the crisis has shown in Australia is that we, across the board, are completely reliant on imports of refined product into country. And, it took all of a couple of days before, there was panic buying and diesel running out and all sorts of things that, really caused some massive headaches across the economy, I would say. And the spiking of prices, it's been insane. And so I think what really has come out of the last couple of months is not only how susceptible we are to these global shocks, but also this recognition on the vertical integration of our fuel system and the reliance on products coming from parent overseas companies, right from the beginning all the way through to the end. And the inability for those that are smaller, smaller operators or newer operators, they actually can't access the market. And so I think that there's been these two things that have happened. We've got the shock and we're like, we need to be making more fuel here. But then secondly, there's been this, and even when we can make more fuel here, that fuel can't make its way to market if there aren't effective government policies to mandate that fuel making its way to market. So as an example, we have 3 ethanol refineries and 3 biodiesel refineries in Australia. They're currently producing 179 million litres of fuel. They could be, with that exact same infrastructure, and they have feedstock available, they could be producing close to 650 million litres of fuel. So an additional 10 days of coverage on the national load, right? And yet we have not seen a single increase in sales of ethanol or biodiesel going into the market. So I think that there's been this, okay, hang on. The system doesn't just work as it should work, because you would think if there's a cheaper product available that can be blended into the system, that they would do that, but it hasn't worked that way. So I think there's been this really strong recognition from government to be like, okay, we get it. That's why mandates are needed, because, these fuel systems were established decades ago and were not designed as a distributed model where there would be multiple players coming into it. So I certainly think that that it's been enough of a shake in Australia to really have policymakers recognising the need for government intervention and mandates. I did not expect that we were going to get that announcement on budget night. We have worked incredibly hard over the last 2 months to raise the profile, to get out there as much as we can, to be advocating as hard as we can. But it was a surprise. I didn't, I wasn't expecting it to be that soon. And I think the reason it came so soon is because of the fuel security crisis. So for us, it's, whilst it's a massive negative in terms of the economy and everything else that's happening, sometimes you need these massive disruptions to take place in order for governments to really assess what do we want the future to look like. It's funny, right before the crisis started, I don't know if you remember, but we had the King and Queen of Denmark were out in Australia. And I was at an event with them, and the King was on stage talking about the 1970s oil shock is when they completely looked at what do we need to do in terms of, our country, and develop that energy resilience themselves. Now, Denmark will be operating on 100% renewable gas by 2030. They really took this shock and said, no, we're not doing that again. We're going to make sure that the next time this happens, we're set and ready to go. So I think, countries that are able to learn from situations and evolve and be brave enough to, take on things like mandates, which 6 months ago was really hard talking to any member of cabinet about a mandate. And now we have a commitment. So I think it absolutely has changed the game.
Yeah, and it sounds like, from both the Indian and the Australian perspective, these have been ongoing processes to really vitalize the bioenergy sector, and it really just requires that immense, very disruptive spark, as you mentioned, to really bring it to the attention of decision makers. I wanted to transition a little bit into feedstocks. I know that we sort of mentioned, Australia has these facilities that have feedstocks, but they're not being utilized. We in Australia have feedstock that could anchor a multi-billion-dollar industry, and yet most of it gets exported. And India has this, as has been alluded to, this vast ethanol capacity to drive alcohol to jet. I'd like to know, from both of your perspectives, how you think, or what are the challenges with sort of aggregating that feedstock and really implementing it into use? And do you think that as we sort of progress through the different technologies that are out there for SAF, whether those challenges are going to be sort of increased or decreased across time? Would I be able to start with you, Shahana?
Yeah, look, I think it's a little bit of a tricky one, because depending on the feedstock, it's a different conversation. So if we're talking about sugar as an example, it's very different to having a conversation about canola, and so then if we're talking about potentially forestry residues or municipal waste or algae, there's so many options. And so I think it's, for us in Australia, there is the advocacy that we are doing is to say, we recognize that as you step through the technologies, it becomes more expensive. And so the way that policy is designed needs to recognize that. A volumetric mandate that isn't linked to carbon intensity isn't going to push us down the line. It's going to get us producing as much as we possibly can of the cheapest possible fuel, right? And so, and eventually we all want to be in the place of power to liquids. There won't be enough, even with India having 55 million, which I can't believe, sugar farmers, and us with all of our available kind of ag and being able to evolve. We all need power to liquid to come online as well. That needs to be a feedstock into the future that's going to be a contributor, because aviation travel is not going to decrease out to 2050. It is only going to get bigger. People are only going to want to travel more. We're not going to change people's behavior on that. So I think for us, the focus is very much on, let's do what we can with what we have now, and let's attract that feedstock to stay in country. The canola, around $6 billion a year of canola that we export, our used cooking oil, our tallow. Let's actually get a policy framework where that stays here. Sugar, same deal, But then I think moving into the next feedstocks, there's going to be a raft of supply chain, things that are going to have to be dealt with. Even like things that people don't think about is, as an example, if we were talking about forestry residues and we were looking at areas that currently there aren't a lot of trucks on those roads, but if we were going to look at plantations in those sites now, okay, how many truck movements are going to be going along those roads? What is that going to mean for the local community? What is that going to mean for the roads themselves? And so I think that the approach that we're taking around advocating to the federal government for this development of this national bioenergy feedstock strategy is really seeking to kind of put some of those, those things in a place, so that we can really evolve as an industry in a way that is going to be sustainable and that has that social license as key to how we develop, whilst at the same time utilising our supply and demand side policies in order to pull those future technologies as quickly through as we possibly can.
Speaking of sort of social license, Deepak, I wanted to pose actually a slightly different question to you. When we're talking about feedstocks, when we're talking about ethanol, there is this inevitable debate about food and fuel. And I know that in the past, the Indian government has stepped in to restrict sugarcane usage for ethanol to try and stabilize domestic sugar supplies. And also, another sort of not so much spoken about issue with this West Asia crisis is the shortage of fertilizers that's also coming down the pipeline. And so I'm curious how you see the industry and policymakers trying to scale SAF without driving up the cost of food or threatening domestic food supply.
Good question. And this food versus fuel is more of a European thing. I was very recently in Geneva during a sugar conference, and during a panel discussion, I was told that Europe is still stuck at E10 with only 10% blending because of the primary concern on food versus fuel. And India is a completely different story. India is very fundamentally different from a very traditional food versus fuel debate which goes on in various countries, specifically in Europe. Because in terms of our ethanol capacities, in terms of ethanol diversion, we basically, as the country, produce much more than what we consume. And if you talk about specifically sugar, we have a system, the government has laid down a proper policy that the sugar production goes as a first priority to the domestic consumption, followed by the diversion into ethanol. And only if you have surplus after diverting into ethanol, then perhaps the surplus could be exported. And we have seen for the last 10 years, the country has produced more sugar than what we can consume at ethanol diversion. Only in 1 year, in 2023, because government anticipated that there might be a lower sugar production, mid-season they restricted the diversion of sugar to sugarcane juice ethanol. But even that, perhaps the anticipation was proven wrong, and that year also the country produced very good level of sugar. So in the sugar sector alone, this is perhaps more about food, fuel, energy, and rural income story. Sugarcane, this is perhaps the world's most efficient tropical biomass crop. And we are producing today sugar, ethanol, bioelectricity, biogas, green chemicals, and now we're planning for SAF as well. So we've done some estimates. So even with the surplus sugar which we are going to have, after diversion to ethanol, we can perhaps by 2040, we can easily produce almost 2.3 billion liters of SAF, specifically from sugar alone. And we all know that sugarcane SAF through the alcohol pathway can achieve more than 60 to 70% reduction in the life cycle greenhouse gas reduction. So I believe we have to also look at the availability of the feedstock. And as a country, as an association, as an industry, we are now continuously working on how to have better varieties which can give better yields, better sugar recovery. So even without increasing the area, we are hoping that in few years we will have much more yield and much higher production. And the surplus, specifically on the sugar consumption, if you talk about, the sugar consumption in the country, specifically in India, has almost stagnated because of various factors. So whatever we produce beyond our consumption will be either diverted to ethanol or perhaps to SAF or maybe some other pathways. But I believe the entire narrative of food versus fuel is not really applicable to this country. And perhaps this entire ecosystem is supporting the farmer income, energy security, and maybe perhaps tomorrow, if we start producing aviation fuel and SAF, towards the aviation decarbonization. So I hope this answers your question.
No, it absolutely does, and I think that's maybe sort of an immediate thought that people have about this food versus fuel debate. And I do know that the Europeans are quite um, interested in that aspect of things. But, for Australia and India, which are these two mammoth sugar producing countries, it seems, to have those resources not be able to be utilized for this purpose is just not good policy, I think. So we've had sort of a discussion about geopolitics and economics of SAF, but there's also a wide range of technologies that Shahana you alluded to that are possible for SAF production. Australia, we have projects at least in the pipeline, both for HEFA and for alcohol to jet. How should the government and investors ideally balance their sort of approaches towards these different technologies? 82% of all SAF is currently created using HEFA. It's an established technology. It's very efficient in its conversion rates. Where do you think that those chips should be placed in the Aussie context?
Yeah, so I think that this is where actually the government needs to play a role, because in anything, right? Like if you think about renewable electricity, the role that government had to play in terms of supporting those new technologies as they were evolving and scaling down in price. The exact same thing needs to happen in liquid fuels. So I think this is around, and certainly the advocacy we've been doing with the federal government is around do what we can with what we have now, but use things like the supply side support. So the $1.1 billion, absolutely have some of that going to HEFA, but actually how can we use government funding to bridge the price gap as you are moving up that technology ladder where it is more and more expensive, but also the amounts are less and less. So that for us is really where the government can play a role in making those projects more bankable. Because the reality is, if an alcohol to jet project was having to compete with a HEPA project, line on line, it's not going to happen. If like an investor is not going to invest on that. So, in any jurisdiction globally, it has required, grant funding to come in for those projects at the early stage. It's taken financing that is able to be provided at really low levels by things such as in Australia, we have the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. So, there's a range of ways that government can actually use its powers to close that gap between technologies that are viable today and the technologies that we're absolutely going to need by 2050 in huge quantities. And we can't just expect that when we need them, that we get to turn them on then. We need to build the supply chain. We need to build the infrastructure in and really have, the feedstocks moving in the right directions. And that's going to take decades for some of these different technologies that are coming online. So, we need to do, I like to say we need to, pat our head and rub our belly at the same time and not just be, no, we're just doing this and that's all we're doing. We've got to be looking to the lens of the future for how much fuel we need to produce, because for Australia, we don't just need to produce the fuel for us. We have a responsibility to our neighbours. New Zealand is really going to struggle in terms of feedstock and their ability to produce their own fuels. Look at the Pacific Islands that are our friends and our neighbours, Indigenous islands. Like it's, we have a responsibility, I think, in Australia to be thinking about the role that we play in ensuring decarbonisation of aviation, not just for Australia, but for the region that we are a neighbour in.
In a similar vein to the question to Shahana, India has this enormous alcohol ethanol capacity. Where do you see alcohol to jet sitting in the Indian SAF ecosystem? And do you see that HEFA might be Do you think that it could be possible for India to sort of leapfrog over the HEFA technology and just sort of really capitalize on its existing strong ethanol, or do you think it's also going to be sort of a graduated and stepwise approach to the different technologies?
See, among all pathways, alcohol to jet has been recognized as the most promising pathways, and specifically for India, because of our feedstock availability and also compatibility in retrofitting capability with the existing ethanol infrastructure, and also the scalability potential. For example, alcohol to jet in India today has a technology readiness level of around 7 to 8. So perhaps after HEFA, SAF through alcohol to jet is the most commercially mature technology. And through alcohol to jet alone, I believe, as I said, India has the potential to produce almost 5 billion liters of SAF by specifically from Madi ethanol, and by 2030. And thereafter, the second generation ethanol, the technology is maturing. We already have some plants in India which are making ethanol out of agricultural residues. I believe beyond 2030, those things could also be deployed and be made out of second generation ethanol. So existing ethanol distilleries, for example, today we have a capacity of producing almost 20 billion liters of ethanol. However, my E20 blending only takes around 11.5 billion. So there's a huge surplus of ethanol which could be diverted to SAF through an alcohol to jet technology. But having said that, the entire deployment of technology in terms of investment is huge. And specifically in India, the entire industry, for example, sugar industry, if we talk about, is a completely regulated sector. Government decides on how much a sugar mill is supposed to give it to the farmer in terms of the sugar cane produce. So that way, for example, way back in 2018, when we had hardly reached a blending of around 3 to 4% in ethanol and gasoline, the government of India came up with a complete roadmap which gave a lot of push to the industry in terms of investment, in terms of the policies like interest subvention, and also the pricing administrative mechanism. For example, since the feedstock prices are decided by the government, the pricing for the ethanol was decided by the government at what cost the oil marketing companies will buy the ethanol from the producers. We need a very similar kind of a roadmap for SAF. As I said, because the feedstock is regulated. If we have certain similar kind of policy, this was there for a program, I believe we can see a lot of investment coming into a SAF, specifically by the ethanol producer, because retrofitting becomes slightly easier for the producers to produce SAF.
And so, when you're speaking of retrofitting those facilities, um, are those facilities compatible with first generation and second generation, or are those separate facilities that would have to be built? Um, is there a way that those facilities can be built so that that transition to the cellulosic ethanol is possible, or does it have to be two separate streams there?
Uh, there has to be a two separate schemes for first generation and second generation ethanol. So there are various pathways. As I said, we are at the TRM level of 7 to 8. Alcohol to jet straight away can be done. At the moment, 2G second generation, we only have a couple of plants. But having said that, tomorrow, if we have more facilities, more plants on second generation ethanol, the ethanol again could be diverted to the integrated biorefineries or SAF refineries, where the ethanol could be used to produce SAF. So I believe somewhere down the line, we will have to see the mix of the feedstock. And as I said, the investment for that kind of investment policy is very important. And we believe that the government, if it comes with the right policy, right pricing, and every stakeholder has to be brought into the fold. The aviation sector has to be ready to buy SAF that particular cost, because obviously at the moment the alcohol to jet is almost 2.5x the present cost of the aviation fuel. So the entire ecosystem, including the consumer, in this case, our airline, has to be brought into the ecosystem. There has to be some kind of a mandate. Then the entire thing will actually be properly laid down and things can work out.
I wanted to just ask a couple more questions in the time that we have left. There's been a narrative for many years that we don't have enough SAF capacity, globally, that is. But there's been some interesting recent analysis that, at least in the European market, which is sort of the dominant mandate-driven market, that there's almost going to be a structural oversupply of SAF between now and 2029. So Neste's expanded Rotterdam facility alone is already outpacing so the EU's 2% mandates. Is this something, this oversupply risk, there's also facilities in China and Malaysia that have come online. Is that something that Australian and Indian governments are thinking about or worried about when it comes to scaling up their own domestic staff capacity? Shahana, can I start with you?
I don't think there are too many airlines out there that are concerned about an oversupply of staff into the marketplace. I think that airlines are concerned about the price of staff, but in terms of supply, no way. The quantities that we need in order to be able to decarbonize aviation are huge. And so I think that there's, and even if you look at within our region in Australia, the policies that are being implemented right around us in terms of, countries that are looking to bring on mandates, 2028, 2029, 2030, and now Australia being one of those. So, I think that what we will see is that supply will be sucked up very quickly. And I think we need to be far more concerned on driving as much demand as we can, bringing down the cost of SAF as much as we possibly can, and ensuring that globally, we're aligned in terms of things like feedstock exclusion, sustainability principles, even emissions intensity ratings, and the way that different feedstocks are rated depending on which scheme you're using. So, I think that a bigger concern for me is how we make sure that globally there is alignment around, a lot of those big principles, because I think that is going to be where we see, as we have in many other things, cheap things flooding markets that have a higher level of standard that they would be seeking to operate under, and trying not to, in Australia, our ag sector is a highly credible sector, and us following that through with our fuel sector as well, that we don't, move to unsustainable practices in terms of fuel, that we maintain that level of sustainability principles in how we move forward.
To finish, I just wanted to, we are a biotechnology research hub. We're interested in India-Australia collaboration. And so I wanted to ask, since we're trying to establish the groundwork of collaboration between these two countries on SAF and on the bioeconomy writ large, where do you think we might be able to find synergy between these two countries when it comes to sustainable aviation fuel? I might say with you, Shahana, if that's okay, and then Deepak, I'll let you respond as well.
Yeah, well, the first thing that I'm going to do is that I'm going to introduce Deepak to Ash Saldani, who is the CEO of the Australian Sugar Manufacturers Association. I've been messaging him while we've been on this podcast. I said, can you believe they have 55 million sugar farmers? Because I think that it's been really interesting to hear what's happening in India and where policy has been able to move things. And I think, we have the Sugar Manufacturers Association in Australia is one of our members. We work very closely with them, and they are very strong advocates for low carbon liquid fuels broadly. Ethanol, definitely very heavy, but SAF is a future kind of play. So I think that probably it would be, for me, the first step is around having a closer level of conversation and discussion. Figuring out what lessons can we learn from each other's countries' approaches. What can we be doing, that we hadn't thought of that you have been doing in India. So for me, I think that there's definitely some learnings there. And then I think for us, one of the focuses for Bioenergy Australia over the next 12 months is around that regional approach. So how from, India down all the way through to New Zealand, how do we try to have a consistent approach in the region around things like feedstock, sustainability principles, or can claim, like all of these pieces that are going to be so relevant for our region. So we certainly will be inviting India to participate in some dialogues moving forward around how we can ensure that there is alignment where possible. We understand it's not always going to be possible, but where possible, we can have shared visions of the future.
Wonderful. Deepak?
Yeah. See, basically, India has done immensely well in the ethanol blending with gasoline. And in fact, when in 2018, the current government came up with a blending roadmap, it thought that we will be able to achieve E20 by 2030, which was advanced by them. And they said, let's try and get it done by 2025. And with a proper policy narrative and everybody coming together, India achieved 20% ethanol blending in the gasoline in 2025, which perhaps in last few years has saved almost 45 million barrels of crude import. And that's a huge number. And we've not stopped here. So why this entire program was brought in also to really give a impetus and push to the rural infrastructure. So this entire program has brought in a huge kind of a rural prosperity, the upgradation of the rural infrastructure across the country. And we are not stopping here. Now government is also planning very soon to roll out E85, and we will see the entire policy roadmap of E85 very soon in India. And OEMs, specifically the auto manufacturers, they are all ready with the vehicle, specifically the flex fuel vehicle, which can take any blend from E20 to E100. Only yesterday, we have a policy uh, organization called Bureau of Indian Standards. They are responsible for making the standards, the Indian standards for fuel, has published the draft standards for E22, E25, 27, and 30. So there is also a plan to move towards higher blending in a calibrated way, and at the same time have the vehicles on the road. So government is moving on various pathways, and SAF also, as we are discussing, is also on the government's radar. Having said that, specifically with Australia, I actually see a lot of future collaboration opportunities, specifically on the policy alignment, because both are, we are both are ambitious on the SAF roadmap, and specifically if we can align India's ecosystem of SAF, and we can also work with, for example, there is a Australian Jet Zero Council or Australian Renewable Energy Agency, which are supporting SAF programs. And specifically on there could be an Indo-Pacific SAF corridor. We can perhaps together develop a regional ethanol-based SAF supply chain, which perhaps can have India, Australia, and Asia Pacific aviation markets. There could be a lot of joint collaboration. In fact, last year in October, we had almost planned our delegation to Australia to understand how the entire industry is planning in moving beyond beyond the ethanol and also on the SAF. But unfortunately, because of certain engagements here, the delegation was postponed. Now we are thinking again this year, sometime later this year, we are planning a delegation of industry, specifically the sugar industry, to travel to Australia and meet our Australian counterparts and also the stakeholders in the government and see if there could be some policy alignment and we can work together on some other pathways.
Thank you so much for your time, for coming on The Future of Biotech. Your insights have been fantastic, and I've really enjoyed this discussion, and I hope the two of you have as well.
Absolutely, it's been great, and I now have a new connection into India. So hopefully you're going to share contact details.
Absolutely, that's what I'm doing the second we switch off here.
Awesome,
wonderful.
So that concludes our first episode of The Future of Biotech, all about sustainable aviation fuels. Join us next time as we discuss the new emerging biotechnology of precision fermentation and our future episode on gene therapies. Thank you all for listening.